Long days, pleasant nights, and welcome to Kingslingers, a Doof media podcast journeying through Stephen King's Dark Tower series and beyond. I am your host, constant reader Scott Daly, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host and constant caretaker, Matt Freeman. How's it going today, Matt?
Oh, it's going good, Scott, just like always, since I've always been here.
It's not a book reference
in this podcast.
I guess it kind of is. I don't know.
I don't know.
He does say you've always been the caretaker here. That's fair.
He does.
There's not a zoom in on a photo of you being here in the 1920s, though.
That's unfortunate.
Can't really do zoom ins in a book, Matt. Sorry.
You can try, but...
Yeah. This week on the show, we are taking one final look at Stephen King's The Shining. That's right. It's another one of our fan favorite overview episodes. I actually think these statistically do the worst. So that's okay. We enjoy doing them.
Yeah, I think they're important. The preface we always give is something along the lines of it helps you see the forest for the trees. Mm-hmm. You step out from the analysis of specific scenes and specific lines of text, and you look at how the whole thing hung together and how you feel about it as a book. I think that's
Absolutely.
worth doing.
I completely agree. And with that in mind, we're going to dive right into it. We've got lots to talk about today. I've kind of collected some general thoughts. And then, of course, we have to go through all of the mailbag questions sent in by our listeners. We do the overview episodes in a little different ways each book, depending on what's going on. Sometimes we just kind of let the mailbag questions we get drive the discussion, and I think that's what we're going to do this week. We have some things that I wanted to talk about with you specifically, but then we have some listener questions that I think allowed us to have some more conversations about some overall things with the book. So that's kind of the way we're going to structure this one.
Sounds good to me.
All right, Matt, let's get into it. The first thing we of course have to begin with is you, Matt, and what you thought of this book. I know, throughout the course of it, you were extremely positive going week to week, but now that you've finished the book and had a week to kind of step back and look at it from afar, what are you thinking about this book? How are you feeling? How are you feeling about how everything wrapped up and how it all looks once it's done?
Yeah, I didn't go through the effort of doing an actual stack ranking recently, but I do think this would be somewhere close to the top of my pile of Stephen King books. Weirdly enough, in terms of like associations, I find myself wanting to link it with Low Men in Yellow Coats.
Interesting.
And the reason is it's like it feels similar to me in terms of being this character study, this painfully honest exploration of a character. There's a lot of painfully honest exploration of childhood in this book via Danny and somewhat via Jack in his flashbacks and in his reflections on his childhood. That, of course, reminds me of Low Men in Yellow Coats. Just for reference, Low Men in Yellow Coats is maybe my favorite thing that King has ever written in terms of just like how it hits me personally. And so I think that's because I think that helps explain why I liked it so much is for me, it grabs onto the thing that is, my favorite thing that King does, which is this, psychology, explorations of childhood, facing the dark truths that live inside us and dragging them out into the light, even if you don't want to see what's there. And then, everything else about the book is great too, right? And it's one of those great King premises. Maybe even, I would say definitely more so than Low Men in Yellow Coats, just in terms of being like a fantastic hook of a premise of like, family goes to a hotel and it's haunted and they get stuck up there. I could probably nitpick the book around the edges just like you could with any book, right? And maybe We'll do a little bit of that today. I never really feel like doing that, honestly, but I think that's where it finally sits for me in terms of how it settles into my landscape of Stephen King appreciation.
Yeah, no, I like that. I think it continues to fascinate and delight me, your absolute love for Low Men in Yellow Coats, because I think the one of the most fun things about Stephen King to me is that every single person you talk to will probably have a favorite story or a favorite book. And I mean, we all like Stephen King generally, but all different of a story speaks differently to each of us. And so the fact that that story really spoke to you at that level just delights me. And I never would have mentally drawn a connection between that and this book, but as you lay it out, I'm just like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. Actually, that is, these are two stories that are very different from each other, but of a piece of kind of the same thing in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. And I guess I'll just draw it a little bit more and say, so actually, let me reflect it back on you, and then maybe I can get a volley going here. Like, where
Sure.
does this book stack up for you? Do you love The Shining? Is it one of your favorite Stephen King books? Did you more put it in this season because it's just a super well known one that's widely appreciated? Like, what do you feel about The Shining?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think I ever would have put it in like my top 5 of King books or whatever. And it's not because I don't like it. I like it a whole bunch. I have very distinct memories of it, of being like the scary one. Like it's the one that scared me when I read it, which is, as we talked about at the very beginning of the book, that it's something that doesn't happen too much with Stephen King and me. Like I think he can be very scary at times, but for the most part, I'm not actually like creeped out when I read his stuff. But this book was the large exception to me with that. It was interesting that on this read I didn't really feel that except for one or two times, and I think I can chalk that up to like entirely the mindset that I'm in when I'm reading for the show, is that I am in a much more analytical mindset and less allowing myself to sit back and be absorbed by the characters in the world, just because that's the thing I'm doing to myself. But no, I have fond memories of it. I enjoy the book, but I never would have considered it like upper echelon King. And you're absolutely right. The reason I put it in here is when you look at our 1970s, if we're picking a book from the 70s and it's a book that we haven't already done, well, we knock out Carrie, we knock out Salem's Lot, we knock out the Stand. There's not too much left from the 70s. And this is an iconic story that, like, if we're going to wrap up with this season, with Stephen King this season, I feel like we had to talk about The Shining at some point. Like we couldn't not do that. So that's really what the decision was here. But yeah, I mean, I definitely appreciate this book on a whole new level after going through all this. I think it is marvelously detailed. It's a character study. It really is. And I think all three of these characters are some of King's absolute best. I think, Jack and Wendy specifically spoke to me in ways that they never have on previous rereads. And it is really remarkable. I was thinking a lot about Salem's Lot as I was going through this book, and the complaints we had with that story that we both really genuinely liked, but just had some issues with a lot of the characters in it. And that is just not the problem at all here. You can definitely see the Stephen King that we love so much, and the type of character work that goes into the Dark Tower series later in his career is on full display here, and it's just remarkable. So yeah. I don't know if now, like you say to me, okay, well, it wasn't in your top 5 before this. Now is it? I don't know. The idea of like attempting to actually rank all 70 something King books is so terrifying to me that I don't know. It's definitely, if I were ranking them, it's definitely moved up. If I were making a tier list, it might have moved up a letter on my tier list.
Yeah. I mean, it might be fun at this point in time for us to both. I think I mentioned this to you at some point in the past, that I made this tool where if you have a list of books, it just compares them 1-to-1, and you just pick, A or B over and over and over and over. And then it eventually sorts it into a stack ranking, which is going to be moderately consistent, because generally if you prefer A to B and B to C, then you prefer A to C. But
sure. Well, I've long thought, by the way, speaking of doing everything for content, because that's who we are, I've long thought, as I am wrapping up my Stephen King read/reread project, hopefully in a couple months, I've been stuck on the book Sleeping Beauties for so long, but I'm a mere 50 pages to being done with that finally. And then I have only a couple more books after that. I've long thought of just doing like, sit me down in front of a camera and talk for like an hour tier ranking these books. So maybe I will do that, because I think it would be a fun way to finish out my whole quest with these books. And then I'd have to make the hard decisions like we're talking about now, but I mean, we'll see. I'm not committing to that.
Yeah. I mean, personally, I'd like to hear you do that and go through that terrible struggle on camera. That sounds really entertaining.
It just would take, there's so many books, Matt. It would take so long.
That's true.
But no, I'll consider it for sure.
Yeah.
But no, I I really, really like this book a whole
Yeah.
lot.
Well, it kind of sounds like we're in agreement. I mean, and I'm not surprised to hear you say that, but there's more fun King books. There's more scary King books. There's maybe even more sort of philosophically rich King books that we've read.
Yeah.
But this is among the best in terms of being a character study and getting the psychology and having like really interesting and unique character. And also just I appreciated the fact that it was kind of this bottle episode of a book.
Sure.
I think I tend to exaggerate the degree to which that's true, but basically you've got these three characters and then Dick Halloran in and out, and then a couple of people around the edges, but that just gives it a really unique feeling and a really unique tone. So yeah, just overall very positive feelings toward this book, and I'm glad that we read it.
Yeah, and I don't really, like you talked about, maybe we'll get into nitpicks. I don't think I'm going to do that today. And I don't know if you had anything specifically you wanted to bring up, that I'll, of course, give you the space to do that. But, we talked last week about the one thing that I didn't really love about the ending, which was the Dick in the shed stuff. And we got, but by the way, plenty of feedback about how I'm completely wrong about that, which is fine. I'm not, I'm not saying that I'm 100% right. I think a lot of people made some good points there, but that was a very minor thing in the grand scheme of my feelings about this book. So I really don't have anything specific that I say I think this book did this wrong. I think it is interesting, when you step back and look at the structure and the kind of the pacing of the book. It is really interesting how, and I think this is a King trend in general, that we start off, very slow, and I don't mean slow as in like uninteresting, but just like we kind of sit with the characters through scenes, and then by the end of it, I feel like we're going a mile a minute. Like the last 100 pages just felt to me like, I think they take place over the course of like 2 days, basically, whereas everything else is over the course of weeks and months. And it sort of just feels like when King does his rising action, he also does speeding up time like crazy too.
Yeah. I'm glad you threw out the word rising action there, because I was trying to find the right words to describe like the only thing I was going to nitpick about, which actually is not a problem with the book. I think it's just the way that stories like this flow. Is that the rising action is super tense and great, and then when the climax hits, I'll speak for myself. Like once the climax hit, I'm just like, okay, I'm done, and I just kind of emotionally check out. It's like it's like whenever I watch Gladiator, there's like a point almost at the end where I'm just like, okay, I'm done, and I like stop paying attention because I don't really care anymore. The thing that I cared about is resolved. And as far as my brain is concerned, the movie is over.
Sure.
Like Gladiator comes to mind because it's a movie where the hero dies close to the end. And it's like, yeah, that's kind of similar to this, where like once Jack is dead, I'm like, well, I don't really care anymore. And also the fact that I already knew the story, so none of this is really a complaint. It's just like, it's kind of an interesting fact about the way that like books take you for a ride, and certain narrative structures, I think, lend themselves toward kind of hitting a point where you're just like, I don't really need to finish this, do I?
Yeah, I wonder how much of that. I mean, I know you said like as you go on through the climax itself, but how much of that did you feel post Jack falling off the wagon and taking that drink? Because I do feel like there is kind of an overall feeling of the book that once Jack has made that choice, everything else that plays out in the book from then on feels less active characters making choices and just us saying, okay, that line was crossed, that choice was made, and now we're just going to sit back and watch how it all plays out.
Yeah, so I did like that, but I liked it for different reasons. I liked it because it felt like we had kind of entered into this nightmare where it's kind of true that you're just watching things play out, but it's in the same sense as like you have like a sleep paralysis nightmare where you're watching things helplessly beyond your control and you don't want them to be happening, which I think that feeling is sort of embodied by our characters, like Wendy, who she feels like she's out of control, or she feels like the situation is out of her control, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
And she's terrified. So, I agree with you that the tone changes very sharply, and Jack kind of stops being Jack at that point. But I liked how it kind of became a nightmare. And then once Jack is dead, like I said, I was like, okay, I understand that the story is over now, and maybe that's part of why the idea of Dick suddenly becoming a villain didn't land for me. Is I was just like, no, the story's over. You can't trick me. I don't know.
Yeah.
Again, none of this is complaining about the book. It's just like interesting how things land is all.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and I think it's kind of interesting because I don't think the tension of that scene is functional in that I don't think anyone reading the book at that point honestly and earnestly believes that Dick is gonna that we're gonna actually play this out and have Dick hunt down Danny, and now they have to kill him.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't think anyone buys that. So the scene itself kind of doesn't carry any tension, but at the same time, do you want a scene in that moment to carry tension? Our heroes have won, the evil is defeated, the hotel is exploding, and the scary manta demon is flying away. Do we want another moment of tension there, really, or do we want just to kind of roll out to the ending from there?
Yeah, it's almost as if you've blown up, the den where the evil nest of creatures lived, and then you fly away back to your spaceship, and then you say you did good, Bishop,
and then Bishop gets stabbed with a hotel ghost,
right? with a giant alien tail that looks like a wasp stinger. And that's how we figured it out. That Aliens was based on The Shining.
I think this is a great pull, actually. And the reason it's a great pull is because the reason King did this in the story is because this is a very, very, very classic horror cliche, right?
Mm-hmm.
The idea of we've won, we've defeated the evil, and no, the evil comes back one last time. They make fun of this in the Scream series all the time. It's like they shoot the bad guy and it goes, oh no, but he always comes back for one final scare. And that's kind of exactly what happens here. And of course Aliens uses it as well, and the horror movies love to use this thing. I mean, even the De Palma version of Carrie had our one final screen to end that film. It's not that I don't like it. I totally see what everyone is saying. I don't know. I felt like even the idea of seeing Dick even entertain the thought of murdering Danny for a minute is kind of confusing the metaphor. But I'm perfectly willing to let it go because I do think this is overall a really marvelous book.
Yeah. That's more complaining than I even wanted to do. And and I kind of want to stress that sometimes it's just interesting to talk about how something landed for you or didn't quite land for you, and you're not even saying it's a flaw of the material. It's just different people process things differently.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the most fun things for me about not just reading but discussing reading with people, because you and I think are pretty similar at times at the things we like, but sometimes even though we both like something, we like it for entirely different reasons, or you're right that sometimes it just doesn't work for us, or sometimes you and I talk about how something bothers us and we get an email from someone that says that didn't bother them at all, or vice versa. We love something and someone else is like, no, it's just really fascinating. You bring everything you are and all your life experiences to the stories, and it's fun seeing the way they ping off those experiences.
Absolutely. Yep.
So I guess I wanted to kind of have a conversation with you, and I don't know exactly how to do this, but when we set about this season, we said, we're going to pick a book from each decade, and we're going to have that book be the best possible representative of the decade for us to kind of get an idea of who Stephen King was in that decade. I think the interesting thing about the 1970s is not only do we have two more stories we're going to be doing in the 70s coming up, both the Night Shift series of short stories and The Long Walk, the Bachman book that we picked, both take place in the 70s. But we also collectively across all of our shows have read quite a bit of King 70s, just about all of it. We've read Carrie for our book club years ago. We read Salem's Lot for season 2. We read The Stand for season 2. And now we've read The Shining as well. So we actually have gotten a pretty good picture of who 1970s Stephen King is. And I was wondering your thoughts on 70s King, if you have any thoughts on separating this guy from the books that you've read that he wrote much later, especially the Dark Tower books that came out only 20 years ago or so. Or is it too early in this process to really do that? And we need a point of comparison. We need to get to the 80s first before we really start saying, okay, who is 1970s king? I don't know. What are your thoughts on this?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, definitely you can draw all sorts of connections, but also I think it's really fun to notice just how different these books are. Like these are really very different kinds of stories. The Stand is this epic. It's almost like he's reacting to the last book he wrote, where the Stand is this. Well, hold on. Did he write The Stand first or The Shining first?
I should know this off the top of my head.
Well, regardless.
Go on, keep making your point and I will let you know.
Yeah, it doesn't really, the order doesn't really matter. It's just interesting to me how, some of these books are like closely focused on one character. Some of them are ensemble. Some of them are epic in scope. Some of them are decidedly narrow and almost claustrophobic in scope. Mm-hmm. Some of them have more of a creeping dread tone, whereas others have a very different sort of almost like Lovecraftian or Gothic tone, which I guess is similar to each other.
The Stand is after The Shining.
Yeah. Okay. So The Stand, the Stand is him trying to go big after he was going, constrained, right? So so it's and he's the same writer through all of it. He has a lot of the same things that he's interested in. He has, for one thing, like all four of these books have some element of like what we call the shine or the touch or whatever. But that I think that's just because he thinks that's a fun literary motif. It's interesting, decade by decade. I think it'll be interesting to look back and compare to the previous decade. But there's a lot of incredibly solid, books in this decade where if this were like all that Stephen King ever wrote, you would still be like, wow, he wrote some real great books. He's a great author. And then he proceeded to have 4 more decades of productivity. So
I think with the exception of maybe Salem's Lot, because I think that's really, really well regarded and well known amongst constant readers, but maybe is not as culturally aware in the general public as these other 3. These are like all time like pop culture stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it is interesting. Like I guess looking at it as just the 70s, it is interesting that you could kind of look at this thing and see that early King is playing with archetype a lot. Like, he's doing Salem's Lot is the vampire book. The Stand is the apocalypse book. The Shining is the haunted house book. Carrie is, I guess, the high school. I don't know how to frame Carrie in that archetypal framing I'm trying to build here, but I'm wondering if that's like, I'm trying to think of all his stories and see, is that just a King thing in general, or is that specifically an early King thing? I think it is probably just an early King thing, because he goes on from here and he does a lot of different stories, and some of them fall under, these are archetypal, horror things I'm going to tap into, but some of them are just him exploring random, weird, crazy things. So I definitely think like it feels in a lot of ways that he's playing. I hate that I'm saying this as I'm saying it, but I'm going to go ahead and say it, like playing it safe, or at least playing it like these are the things that people are going to like the most, that have the surest chance of becoming popular. And that makes sense, because at this phase in his career, he is also at the whim of his publisher in a way that he stops being pretty quickly after the 70s, right? Where he has enough support and command that he can kind of dictate what he wants to publish versus having them dictate it for him. But these books feel like King operating in a lane that it would be like if in the early 2000s you were specifically writing like romantic vampire books, right? Like you're specifically operating in a lane that will be popular to the most amount of people.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, for sure with Salem's Lot, because it was self-consciously supposed to be Bram Stoker's Dracula set in Maine.
Mm-hmm.
where he's taking a thing that's already popular and known and tapping into what works about that and kind of reinventing it in his own way.
Yeah.
I mean, and then definitely later in his career, he does crazy stuff like you said. But I do think, I mean, this is something I've said before. Like, I think even for the crazy stuff, he always is aware of like, okay, but what's the pitch? Like, what's the one
Sure.
liner?
Yeah.
Like, evil demon clown. Um, you know, world-ending pandemic is one such pitch. It's just that's sort of already a thing that's not as weird and crazy as evil demon clown is. But you still get it when you say evil demon clown. You're like, okay, where are you going with
Sure.
this? You got me,
Yeah, that's a really good point. I don't think that's something we've talked about too much over the course of this show. I mean, we've talked for hours and hours and hours about how good King is as a writer, but there are, thousands of really, really good writers out there. King is also like a really good salesman. And I don't mean just in like his ability to get in front of a room and sell you on a book, but the ability for the book to sell itself is really, really interesting, actually.
Yeah. I mean, I think that he does think about this. Like, you could say, I mean, the Talisman may seem like a super weird book in some ways, but you can pitch it really easily as just being like, well, it's like a fantasy quest novel, except it's America. It's about America and about an American kid. Like the bam, there's more to it, obviously, but like that you can do that with almost all of his books. And I do think he thinks about that when he's putting them together. And I think it's not okay, it's probably partly for marketing, because he definitely has an eye for this or an ear for this or whatever part of your body you would use for marketing. But I think also it's just part of his storytelling sensibility, where he's like, I need the story to be clear. I need there to be a concise kernel of like, what is this story that I'm anchored to? And then I can go wandering around in the space of that idea.
Sure.
But I always have to come back to the core of it. And that, I would say the stories of his that we have maybe liked less have been the ones that you couldn't just point to and be like, that's the one with blank, because it becomes shaggy and you can barely even remember what happened because you don't have a kind of a cubby to put it in,
Not to put you on the spot, but I'm curious what story you were thinking about when you were saying that.
I was sort of thinking of Insomnia, which is funny because I actually liked Insomnia a lot. So I was thinking of Insomnia because I wouldn't know how to describe Insomnia to somebody.
I completely agree. That's the exact book I was thinking about as you were saying that. And again, I think that's a book that you and I both really liked, and there's a lot of good stuff in there. But I agree, maybe this is one of the reasons why Insomnia is one of the few King stories that has not been adapted, is because it just doesn't have that easy to understand, easy to digest, and easy to sell central hook. It's a really good, really interesting book, but it just doesn't have that.
As much as I like, here's the funny thing. I remember liking Insomnia. If you were to ask me now, like, well, why did you like Insomnia? I would have a harder time because I would have to literally like go through the story in my brain and be like, okay, so, and then like, okay, and then, it was the thing I liked about it was like this part of it, right? But it's like it's disorganized.
Sure.
And so when I think through it, I have to reorganize it in my brain.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me. Yeah.
Because like where do okay, so there's this old guy and he can't sleep. All right, you follow me? Okay, wait, where are you going?
No, I get it.
Yeah.
One thing, continuing to play the comparison game, we talked a lot about The Stand and how this was a very angry book of its time. This is a very late 70s, political and just cultural upheaval in the country book. And it is interesting to me when I think about The Shining. I don't necessarily see that in this novel. And maybe there was no room for it in this very insular novel with 3 characters where they spend 90% of the time trapped in a hotel together. I don't know. Do you agree with that? Or did you see any of that kind of poking around the edges?
Well, when you say angry, I mean, in sort of a like politically minded anger. Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, Jack Torrance is a very angry character, but I don't think
Sure.
that's in the way that you meant with that question.
Well,
Like
yeah,
the
and I
yeah.
I don't know. Maybe there is, if we try to really dig at it, there's a way of using who who Jack Torrance is and who King constructs as this character as a reflection of a certain sentiment that existed amongst some people at the time.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. Definitely a
Not
very, very different tone, though.
Yeah, no, totally. Um, there is a level of kind of righteous anger in The Stand, I think, where, like, this is the end of the behavior that's happening right now, and see, like, you did it. This is your fault, America. People in charge, just greediness in general. This is your fault. You created this, and there's a righteousness to it, that I
Yeah.
just don't think is in The Shining. Where
No.
and I wonder if it's because this character is so much more personal and close to King. Like you kind of want to use Jack Torrance as a stand-in for a certain type, for not just a stand-in for struggles with alcoholism, but stand-in for a certain type of person, a certain type of man. We could even say it, and a reflection of a certain, masculine type of behavior. But you can't even necessarily really do that, because I think King has such empathy for this guy, understandably, because as he claims, unbeknownst to him, he was writing very much about himself in a lot of ways.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, Jack's anger is a problem, whereas the characters in The Stand, their anger is justified.
Mm-hmm.
So there's definitely a huge difference there. I don't have much more to say about that. I guess like
Yeah.
definitely Jack is, I think in King's mind, he's a guy who's doing his best, but he has some problems in
Mm-hmm.
his mind that are holding him back. And one of those problems is his temper and his pride and his anger. And that's, I think King probably feels like that kind of self-pitying, self-justifying anger is different from the kind of righteous anger of the characters of The Stand.
Sure. No, I get that.
Yeah.
Do you think, speaking of losing his temper, you made me remind myself of something that I noticed while you're reading the book, is that the concept of, Jack Torrance and his temper is such a prevalent, constant thing in the early parts of the novel,
Mhm.
and it's kind of completely abandoned in the
Mhm.
latter parts of the novel. And a less charitable person could say, oh, that's King dropping the ball and just forgetting a core tenet of his character. But I actually think that is by design, because it is really interesting how this character, who is kind of knowingly battling against the fact that he loses his temper all the time, just like stops having that battle altogether.
Yeah.
And it's even before he takes the drink that this happens, that he's not, like, because you remember there was that one chapter where, like, losing his temper was like kind of like a metronome in his head, that he kept repeating it over and over and over and over again, and that just completely goes away.
I think you're totally right that I don't even think it's a stretch at all to say that it's an intentional choice that it goes away, because
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it kind of reminds me how everybody got a little weird after the COVID lockdowns, and you become acquainted with, like, the way that the not literally the voices in your head, but like the way that you kind of talk to yourself, the way that you think changes when there aren't people around that you kind of have to perform for. And so, like, the cabin fever element of Jack being locked in the building with only his wife and son, he has sort of forgotten that he has a temper.
Mm-hmm.
And the temper hasn't gone away.
Yeah.
He's just that, like, all of his emotions have become justified now. And so when he lashes out, that's not his temper. He's right to be mad.
Yeah.
Right? That's the shift.
Do you feel that the book captures that cabin fever? Because, I mean, it's not that I disagree with you that that's a element of the story, but I do think it's interesting in the ways in which, I don't know, I never felt like the book was shining its lights on the general frustration and um, loss of patience that can come from being trapped in a single place with just a couple people. I don't know. It didn't seem like that was ever at the forefront of the book's mind.
I agree that it wasn't a focus. I don't know if I want to hold that against it though. I think it's just I don't think.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I guess it the thing that's interesting is it's focusing more on the effects of the cabin fever than like the awareness of the cabin fever.
Mm-hmm.
Like for me personally, I probably became just as weird as anybody during the COVID lockdowns. But like I wasn't sitting around like rocking to myself going like, oh, I'm going crazy because of the lockdowns. Like if anything, I was like, this is relaxing. I don't have to go to work. And that's, and like while actually becoming weirder and weirder with time. Yeah. Right. So,
well,
yeah.
No, I mean, I guess like, kind of ruining the conversation we're going to have next week. But one thing that occurs to me about Kubrick's movie is the scene where, Jack's sitting in the room typing, working on his play, and Wendy comes in with like a sandwich or something, and he gives the line like if I'm in here and you hear me typing, or no matter what you hear, don't come in here, don't bother me, this, and that I think is Kubrick kind of demonstrating the cabin fever and frustration that builds when you're only seeing one person at all time, and and they're doing a thing that annoys you, but you can't leave, and they're annoying you, and it's a completely irrational level of annoying because they're not actually doing anything annoying. It's just like you've just been with the same person over, and it feels like this book doesn't actually want to do that. And I think I agree. I'm not saying this as a critique of it or anything, because I think the book just has other things on its mind, and I think those things are very fascinating and fun to explore like we did. It just occurred to me as you were talking about that like the cabin fever nature, like you could not call this a cabin fever story because it's just not what it is actually. Like it's so interesting because it presents itself as one almost at the beginning. We have you have the idea of Delbert Grady, and he went insane and killed his family, and I think that a lot of the cultural like osmosis around the story actually presented as like people go up and they're forced to live together for however long and they all go crazy. Like I think during the lockdown people were making comparisons to The Shining actually, but it's just not that really. Like Jack didn't try to murder his wife and son because they were annoying him and he couldn't get away from them. Like that's not the reason.
Yeah. I mean, he does, we did point out that he kind of begins to hate Wendy more and more, or you could say his dislike of her increases and his love for her fades away. Mm-hmm. But I think you're right that it's not like because they're living in the Overlook together and thus, technically they're not even like the classical cabin fever is like you're literally in a cabin. And so you can't get away from the other person. Uh-huh. And it actually just grinds away at you until you snap, which is not possible in the Overlook. So like
it's too big. Yeah.
It's too big and you can just get away from the other person. So yeah, it's a different thing. And that's, yeah, I mean, I agree with you. Basically, the King's not really trying to do that with this book.
Yeah. It's just a fascinating thing that didn't really occur to me until just this moment. So I thought we'd talk about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
So the only other thing I wanted to talk to you about before we move into the questions and some of the things that they're posing is the prologue. Did you get a chance to read this short little thing?
I read most of it. I didn't actually make it all the way through. It was longer than I expected.
Yeah.
Considering that it was supposed to just be a prologue, and I mean, I as much as I read, I was like, I can't imagine reading all of this. And then it's just like, and then we get dropped into Jack Torrance. Like that would be so weird to me. It's so interesting that he, I don't know. What do you think about this? I haven't had much time to process it, but, and honestly, I was like, this is probably, I just don't consider it canonical, I guess is what I'll say.
Yeah.
What do you feel about it?
So yeah, so to fill everyone in, there was a prologue originally that was going to be included called Before the Play. There's actually also an epilogue called After the Play, which I had never and still have not read actually. I think they ended up being in like a special edition of The Shining that came out by a different publisher a few years ago, but both were removed from the novel. The prologue was later published in a magazine like 5 years after The Shining came out. Um, I so here's how I feel about the prologue. I think our listeners that have been listening for a long time know my feelings on prologues in general, which is I don't love them, and I think the shorter the better. Because if you're calling something a prologue, you're in essence saying this is not a part of the main story. And my question is, okay, well then why don't we just get to the story then? I think it's interesting to read as a person who has already read this book and knows everything about it. I think you're absolutely right that had this stayed in the way it was, I think it's just really strange to start the book off this way. It's really interesting because you can kind of see, so for those that have maybe never read it, it's a series of 5 kind of short stories about the history of the Overlook Hotel, or should I say 4 short stories about the history of the Overlook Hotel, 1 short story about a young Jack Torrance who is chased by his drunk father up into his treehouse and then falls out and breaks his arm. And it's really interesting because obviously it's showing us stuff that we see later in the novel or is referenced to later in the novel. Like the first short story is of the original builder and kind of how his life was ruined by the ownership of the hotel. The second story is a woman in the 1920s who stayed at the hotel for her honeymoon and like had horrible nightmares, and it kind of ruled over her life. It's just these little vignettes about stuff that we end up reading through the perspective of Jack Torrance later in the book, but we actually get to see it. And it does strike me as such a weird thing to do. Like I'm imagining reading all these short stories and then going to the parts of the novel where Jack is discovering this stuff and like having it retranscribed to us, only a shortened, condensed version. And I just don't think that would actually be very good.
Yeah. I mean, some of it, okay, so there's like all this stuff about the hedge animals in there. Yeah. And I was like, oh, I guess this is kind of explaining why the hedge, because I remember, funnily enough, right. Our last episode, I was like, what do the hedge animals have to do with anything? Yeah. But then the prologue, it kind of explains them, but in a way where I'm like, well, this is exactly the kind of thing where I don't want an explanation, actually. Like I wasn't really complaining. I was just kind of being silly. Yeah. I like weird and unexplained stuff. And yeah, you're right. I mean, it didn't, the problem for me is it didn't really hook me dramatically. It was, King, there are characters in the the prologue or what? Yeah, prologue, right? Prologue. Yeah, there are characters, but you don't fall in love with any of them. There was one of them that I thought was fun. Honestly, there was only one of them that jumped out to me as like, oh, I'm kind of into this actually.
Which one was that?
It was the I forget the name. It was the woman who had married the
honeymooner.
Yeah, the honeymooner. And they were playing bridge and so forth. And it was like, okay, this is like a story. This is like, and it wasn't, what was interesting to me about that one in particular is it's like, oh, I don't already like know exactly what's going to happen here because it's not deeply intertwined with like the roots of the hotel. This is just like, oh, this is some vignette of some other thing that happened at the hotel, probably ending in murder or death or suicide or something.
I found it very odd that in that one, like she's hearing, like in her mind pops in, gotta watch the boiler because it creeps. Mm-hmm. And she's like, what the fuck does that mean?
Uh-huh. Right.
It's summer. And like, I don't know. I think, so here's what I think overall. I think they're good reads. They're well written. I think everything that is learned in these stories, I think would be disastrous to the novel on a first read. I don't want to learn the history of the Overlook Hotel before the characters that I care about enter it. I don't want to learn Jack's history with his father before that is revealed to us slowly through Jack's kind of segmented narrative of exactly how it happened. I don't want to do that. And the idea that like we learn that Jack's father was a horrible scumbag that got drunk and broke his son's arm, like before we've even met Jack Torrance, No, that sucks. I don't want that.
Yeah.
I think the way the novel did it was so clever in that, like, we know something's going on with this guy. We know there's something underlying the anger and the need to drink. And the book kind of slow rolls the reveal of what his childhood was like. And I found that illuminating and fascinating, and really pulls you through it. And the idea that we'd get that in a prologue just kind of sucks to me.
Yeah. What it felt to me was like King had given himself a few sort of runs at the thing where he wasn't quite sure where to start with the story. So he wrote a few little vignettes of things that had happened in the hotel, or vignettes about his history. And then maybe, for all we know, in the process of writing those, it occurred to him like who the protagonist of this story needed to be. And then he started the book, and then he, stepped back from the whole thing and was like, okay, this is a novel about Jack Torrance. All that other stuff was, that can go in some short story collection some other time. That doesn't go in this novel.
Yeah.
Which is like the obviously correct decision, and he made the obviously correct decision. But I can kind of see like why he might have written this other stuff in the first place.
Yeah, I don't know. I tried to look this up while you were talking, and I don't know who it was that made the decision to carve this out of the novel originally, whether it was King's decision himself or whether the publisher looked at it and said, no, you got to get rid of this stuff. I think they made the right decision no matter what. I would like to give credit to that to Mr. King, that he looked at this and said, this doesn't really work with what I did. But I don't know. I think the story you probably didn't get to is the fifth one, which is just basically a reenactment of the gangsters coming in and murdering those other gangsters that we see Dan in the presidential suite where Danny sees the blood on the wallpaper. And it's just one of those things where you're like, okay, I didn't need to see that scene play out, because it just plays out exactly like you think it would. Like, they walk up to the guys guarding the door, they put shotguns to their chests and pull the trigger, dead. Then there's the guy that they're there to assassinate is sitting in the room. They smash open the door and shoot him, and then they run away, and that's pretty much it. And it's like, I got that happened from the book, like I didn't need to see that actually play out in real time for me to understand that the Overlook is bad and death happens there. It just, again, a fascinating like addition and addendum to the story, that it's like, okay, these are things that was referenced in the book, and now we get to see them actually play out. It's like a fun little writing project that I felt like King was doing there. But as a prologue, no. Mm-mm.
Yeah. I mean, it's the kind of thing where I think I'll be surprised if I find out that it was all, it was King's publisher telling him, oh, you can't put this in here. Like it's seems so straightforwardly obvious from a narrative standpoint that this only hurts your ability to like enjoy the unfolding of the story.
Sure.
But we'll see.
All right, so that is before the play. The only other thing I wanted to say here, Matt, and correct me if I'm wrong, listeners, I asked Matt about this before. He couldn't remember specifically, but I don't know if we ever talked about the dual meaning of the name of the hotel itself, the Overlook Hotel, which is obviously named for the overlook that it sits upon, but also to overlook something is pretty important to what this story is doing, right? They're overlooking their problems. They're overlooking the core root of the issue here.
Yeah, I don't think we talked about that usage. It's I like that it kind of has the foreboding connotation of something watching over you. From some high window, the ghost is looking down on you. But I also, of course, I love that idea because thematically the book is so much about Jack refusing to note, or failing to notice, to be more charitable, his flaws, and Wendy failing to notice Jack's flaws, and Danny failing to notice his parents' flaws, and everyone just kind of sleepwalking into this disaster that was, it could have been avoidable if they hadn't overlooked all of the warning signs.
Yep.
Yeah, it's great.
I love it. Okay, so we're going to kind of move into our listener questions a little bit here. First up, we have Walking Dude 22, who presents to us the lovely no ghosts theory. So I'll read Walking Dude's response and question here, and then we'll talk about it ourselves.
Okay.
I want to talk about the final descent of Jack into madness. I personally take the view that Jack is much more culpable in his own destruction than the book textually says. Did the Overlook give Jack real booze? Kind of, just like the Overlook destroyed the CB radio to cut the Torrance family off from life support. How does the Overlook do such things? It manipulates a human agent. Jack was sleepwalking when he destroyed the CB. What else did he do while he was sleeping? Is Jack clever enough to sneak a few bottles of liquor up the mountain while his wife is unaware? What was Jack really doing down in the basement while perusing the receipts? Just a sip, just to take the edge off. Wendy will never know. Hell, he just came up with a narrative that fits. Ghosts? The spirits poured it for me. It's totally Jack's MO. Do irresponsible, selfish, and dangerous things. Blame someone or something else. Rewrite the story so that you didn't set the timer forward or break your son's arm in a moment of deliberate wrath or throw away the distributor cap for the snowcat. I like to imagine what the bar scene would look like if Wendy crept up quietly from behind. Jack sitting at the bar with a bottle of gin and a martini glass. He would be telling his angry and frustrated story to Lloyd. He would be answering in a different voice, responding with Lloyd's half of the script, talking himself into a murderous rage. In my mind, this is a way spookier scene without ghosts than it is with them. So my question is, what are your thoughts of a no ghosts interpretation? What do you think of the idea that Jack's rampage was premeditated? I mean, he said, I won't murder my family because we'll have books and puzzles to occupy our time, yet we never see Jack with either of those activities. All right, Matt, no ghosts. What do you think?
I mean, I love it. Do I think that the text supports it? Not particularly, because of the whole final act.
Sure.
But I love the idea of it. Like, I love the idea that it's actually just the unraveling of this man's mind and all of the, like we said, all the stuff he has overlooked, all of the stuff that's built up, all of the problems in his life that have built up that he thought he was going to escape from by going to this cabin, this hotel, have actually just festered and exploded because that's not how you deal with your problems.
Yeah.
I think there's maybe, there's definitely more than zero textual support, because a lot of the stuff, a lot of the stuff that's happening to Jack, kind of, he's the only one who sees it. And then, of course, what contradicts it is that, like, Wendy and Danny can, like, hear what's happening, right? So
yeah.
So the text, I think, fairly strongly contradicts the idea that it's all in Jack's head.
Yeah.
But I love the idea that it's all sort of, that Jack brought this all with him in some sense, even if it's not literally all in his head.
I love the idea that Walking Dude presents here, that Jack just, like, snuck down the Sidewinder, bought a few pints and snuck them up, and just, like, his internal narrative just completely erased that from happening. I do think that if that were the case, the book would probably eventually reveal that, just like it revealed the timer and everything else he was doing. But the idea that he would so cleverly bury that and push that blame off to some external force, I think is perfect Jack. So I love that idea. I generally agree with you. I mean, I think you could make a harder case for this in the movie than you can in the book, because I think really the only definitively supernatural thing that happens in the movie is that someone lets him out of the pantry that he's locked in, which also happens in the story. But yeah, in this story, there's, like, the hedge animals and a lot less textual support for this idea that there's no ghosts and this is all just Jack. But I like the read a lot, because I think I agree with where I do generally agree with Walking Dude is just how much blame and culpability Jack Torrance has in everything that happens here.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing is, I mean, we talked about this plenty at the time, but just to one sentence summary, like, I was calling out almost to an obnoxious degree how much of the stuff toward the beginning of the movie, book rather, is ambiguous as to whether is this something Jack is imagining, or is this something that's happening? And the text, I think the text is being intentionally ambiguous, and it's playing this game where it's like, okay, is Jack losing his mind, or are there ghosts? And then at a certain point, the book basically just goes all the way and is like, yeah, it's definitely ghosts. But to me, some of the most fun stuff in the book was the stuff where you have that ambiguity and that uncertainty. So that's what I like about this reading.
No, I agree, and I like that. I think the book is definitely playing with the tension of that uncertainty, and then like all horror things, it has to eventually take that tension away, and make it textual. But no, it's a good read for sure.
Yeah. All right. So next, there's sort of a subheading here for world building.
Yeah, we had a couple questions around the world building conversation that we had last week. This first one that you're about to read is not actually a question, just more of a comment that I thought was interesting and worth discussing here. So go ahead.
All right. So Burning Beard 138 says, regarding Tolkien and world building, was just listening to the new episode, and in particular the part of the conversation about world building. I'm currently reading through some of the later volumes of the History of Middle-earth, and it strikes me that in all likelihood, we didn't get more actual stories from Tolkien because after Lord of the Rings, he kind of got into the weeds with world building concerns. He spent most of the next 30 years after writing Lord of the Rings trying to bring his created world more into harmony with a more realistic worldview and into sync with each other. So queries like, where do orcs come from? How did elvish populations propagate after creation? How many hours were in a Valiant day? Are interesting things for fans to ponder, but mostly things that don't really have an effect on the story itself. So certainly there's a balance, but I would have to agree that with King, that the story has to come first, and if it breaks a rule or two or leaves ambiguities in your created world, then so be it.
Yeah, I like this a lot because, I think last week we were kind of struggling with the idea, or at least I was struggling with the idea that I typically don't care much about world building in my stories, and yet Lord of the Rings is one of my favorite series of all time, and Tolkien is kind of like the king of world building. And so I was like kind of wrestling with how do I not care about most of this stuff, but I really love this guy's books. And I think Burning Beard's like idea here is that, well, he wrote the stories and then he spent the rest of his life like filling in the world behind it. And so this is a rich, totally thought out world, but the stories themselves are really only one glimpse of that in these questions that Burning Beard asks here, which kind of sort of do have answers to them, just aren't relevant to that story at all.
Yeah, they're not relevant, and I think even Tolkien, for all that he loved his world building, knew that it would have been a massive drag and distraction if he just like told you all of this information.
Sure.
I keep thinking about the video game Elden Ring, which I've been playing again recently.
Again?
Yeah, I got back into it, and I think like for reasons that are pertinent to this conversation, because like I found that I was actually watching a lot of YouTube videos about Elden Ring, like story and lore and background, and I was like, this is a really compelling world. And then when you play the game, like most of the game, for those who aren't aware, is you're just kind of like wandering around, seeing like a weird knight in some weird armor, and you kill him, and then you go on and you see some other weird walking mausoleum of stone, and it's just like there's a cool castle and weird monsters, and it's the thing is, all of it is actually this like totally coherent, like maybe nearly Tolkien level, like self-consistent world with backstory and everything is, but like your experience playing it is actually just a bunch of shit happening. and I actually like that. Like, and I like that about Lord of the Rings. Like, you don't get bogged down in the genealogical differences between Gondor and Rohan. You just kind of get the vague sense that these are two nations with maybe some bad blood between them, but definitely a lot of history. And that's like all you need. And they understand, and Tolkien understood that, and King definitely understands that. So
yeah, no, I get that. I got to play that game one day.
Yeah.
I will say here, as we kind of exit this conversation in particular, I don't think there's anything wrong with like being super into world building and like that being the thing that brings you to stories. Like, it's not for me, but I want to be clear here that I'm not saying like it's wrong if that's your favorite part of reading stories. I think you would probably often be extremely frustrated with Stephen King if that is like the thing that drives you to storytelling in general, is this expansive and detailed world building. I think he'd probably frustrate you more than he doesn't frustrate you. But I'm not saying like there's a wrong way to appreciate stories.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, next we have Baby Can You Dig Your Sam, this is kind of a sort of at least a shining world building question. They ask, so what was controlling the malevolent forces at work at the Overlook? Was it a demon? Was it Horace Derwent? Or is it similar to the Marston house in Salem's Lot? Was it bad things that had happened at a place that created a monster? Or is the place inherently bad and attracted bad things to it? So that's like not. It's kind of a let's build the world for The Shining a little bit here, right? What do you think on this?
I mean, honestly, I love that we don't know, and I realize that's like the most cop out answer possible.
Yes,
but
specifically, yes.
I would like, I feel like the best way to ruin this would be to have a big thing where you're like, there was a demon that entered the house on its construction that was summoned by an old witch who had been wronged by Horace Derwent on the street, and that's why, that's the explanation. I would just be like, oh
yeah. Or even the burial ground thing, which was an invention of the movie and not mentioned at all in the story.
Yeah, right. And I know I don't particularly like that in the movie either. Like I think so you know, if you're going to make me pick one of these things, I guess it's actually just literally like a place where bad things happen, accrues what you could sort of call psychic or metaphysical traumas, in the same way that like Jack himself kind of, he's this so let me step back and say, like, this is the way that I think I like to think about things, and maybe we like to think about things, is like, well, what is the thematic or metaphorical resonance here? And you say, like, how is Jack similar to the Overlook Hotel? They're both, you know, they were sort of born in innocence, in the sense that it's just like, it's just a hotel, it's just a baby, but there was something wrong. There was something wrong at the core. That there was a father who was just a bad dude who inflicted all of his evil onto his son, or there was the guy who built the hotel was a bad dude who inflicted all of his problems onto the hotel. And instead of being able to rise above this, of course, it just gets worse, and it sinks into the floorboards, just the way that the trauma sinks into Jack's mind, and you end up with kind of a monster. And you know, Jack is kind of a monster. He ends up being a monster, and the hotel ends up being a monster. And it's interesting because it's not the hotel's fault that it's a monster, and it's so, you know, we like to play with these concepts, but you could say it's not Jack's fault that he becomes a monster because of all the abuse he suffered. So I think
the only time I push back against, oh, it's not Jack's fault, is if we're trying to remove like culpability for him. So we can say that he is a product of his origin, while also still saying he's responsible for all the choices he makes.
Yes, exactly. So that's the way I like to look at it and think about it.
I like that. Well, what I like to look at is the Wastelands, in which Susanna is getting down with an evil demon. And when she releases the demon, this is what it says. As its invisible weight fell away, she glimpsed it, an inhuman shape like a manta ray with huge curling wings and something that looked like a cruel bailing hook curving out up from beneath. So that's the sex demon in the Wastelands. And the book describes this thing as a manta ray. So it's a demon. Asked and answered. Done.
It was retconned to just be one of those summoning circle demons from Midworld. Yeah.
All joking aside, I really think it's just that like King probably finds like the look of manta rays kind of creepy, because they are kind of creepy, and just used it in multiple places. As some creepy malevolent force that you don't fully understand.
Yeah, I mean they look like, you know, demons because they got like horns and everything. So I get it.
Baby Can You Dig Your Sam also says, you guys haven't talked about the use of Poe's Mask of the Red Death, both in The Shining and Song of Susanna. Now's your chance. All right, Matt. The question I have for you is, do you even remember that?
I don't remember. I mean, it's funny now that you mentioned the idea of the Dark Tower here. I am thinking about like the stuff involving like the drawers and how some of these things remind me of the hotel, but no, I do not remember the Mask of the Red Death being in The Shining.
So the Red Death in the Dark Tower universe was what killed all the people of Fedek. It's the disease that kind of spreads through that. And in the Song of Susanna specifically says, like out of Edgar Allan Poe, what is happening here?
Okay.
And so I think it fits perfectly in the world of the Dark Tower, where stories are kind of becoming realities in a lot of ways. I mean, it is interesting, the idea that like Fedek was this place, like kind of an ultimate realized version of the Overlook, I guess. Like let fester for I'm not quite remembering how long like Fedek was around, but like imagine if the Overlook was left to fester for hundreds of years and just like got worse and worse and worse. That is kind of Fedek, and I think that fits perfectly with this idea of the Mask of the Red Death being the story about like things collapsing around us, and we're just going to continue to have a party and ignore it and run away from the truth of everything. Overlook it, you could say.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. That's great. I mean, there's so much. I mean, I am going to have to reread The Dark Tower after we finish all these books, because I'm sure I'll find all these other connections, like, you know, what seemed at the time like a throwaway Poe reference. You now realize, yeah, it's a Poe reference, but it's also the Shining reference, actually. I haven't read The Mask of the Red Death, and I probably should read it just to sort of tie that literary bow.
Yeah, I feel like it's pretty short. I think you could read it in like half an hour, but it's been a while.
Okay. All right. Next question is from Steve Living Room. They say, is The Shining the most disturbing book you've ever read? If not, what is? For me, it ties with Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. The Shining was horrific because of how easy it was for King to show the path of a parent becoming a monster. Bury My Heart was beyond disturbing for its realism in just how depraved, ignorant, arrogant, and wrong America was in dealing with Native Americans. And then they say Blood Meridian comes in third.
What do you think, Matt? Is it the most disturbing book you ever read?
I think I think American Psycho is the most disturbing book I've ever read.
I think The Shining was too entertaining for me to be disturbing. I mean, I think there were certainly moments in it that I found very disturbing. There were moments of real, like, I can relate to that, and I'm relating to a guy that has just hurt his child, you know, which really disturbed me. And we talked about those moments when they came up, but like, I think overall, I think once Jack like passes a certain threshold, like I stop associating myself with him, because I'm comfortable in saying I'm never going to do that particular thing. And therefore the level of disturbing I felt like kind of went down as the book went on.
Yeah, there's a weird kind of U-shaped curve here, because and I'm kind of going to talk out of both sides of my mouth here, because like American Psycho, Blood Meridian, Fight Club, I would say these are three of the most disturbing books I've ever read, except at a certain level of disturbing, you just put the whole thing at arm's length. And it's just like, this is just kind of a weird, bizarre spectacle that's kind of bouncing off of me. Like I kind of felt like that with Blood Meridian, where I don't know that I was as disturbed as I was even like supposed to be by Blood Meridian, because I was just kind of numbed by it at a certain point.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened to me with Blood Meridian. And actually, like, our conversation about that book was more disturbing and uncomfortable to me than the actual reading of it, is because we kind of had to force ourselves to look at it and talk about it. And where the actual reading of the book, I just got to a point where I was just like numb, totally numb.
Yeah. Whereas this book, it definitely gets in past your defenses and sits with you. And so it's able to kind of hit you when you're more sensitive, because you're more receptive to it.
Yeah.
So there's kind of it's complicated. I don't really have an answer. I see the point that Steve Living Room is making here, though. It's really interesting.
I do think I've given this answer before, but I think Library Policeman by Stephen King is the most disturbing thing I've ever read. And we will not be covering that on the show, Matt. Don't you worry.
Okay.
You don't want to read it.
I won't.
Okay. Next we have Toastcat7594, who says, so just by chance, I was catching up while following your coverage of The Shining, going through the latter half of season 2 at the same time. As a result, I went through The Talisman, Black House, and The Shining, and as part of my own chronological read through, Dr. Sleep at the same time. I couldn't help but start to compare the characters of Jack Sawyer and Dan Torrance, both characters originally written by younger Stephen King and sequels written decades later as an older, wiser man, seeing how the characters went through their own arcs of development as they grew, how their experience with magic, both white and black, how much they remember it all and react to, and how it all made them who they are as adults by the end of the story. I think an interesting conversation could come of how alike and different they become as a result of these journeys. What do you think about this? I think this is a really interesting idea, and I think we have to preface this entire conversation with the fact that you have only seen the film version of Dr. Sleep and not read the novel, so your point of comparison can only come from that version of Dan Torrance.
That's correct. I mean, it's funny. I'm also thinking about Bobby Garfield, and I'm thinking about Jake. So that there's a few King characters who come to mind when you bring up this archetype, but I get the idea that there are probably more parallels between those particular two.
Yeah, I mean, kids who go through pretty traumatic events as kids and then kind of grow out of them. I think it's interesting, again, talking about just the movie version of Dr. Sleep, we meet Dan Torrance as an alcoholic who has kind of not forgotten the events that happened to him at the Overlook, but pushed away from them. And then we meet Jack Sawyer as a man who has literally forgotten the events of his earlier novel. Mm-hmm. Which is interesting because Jack's story, while filled with trauma, certainly is a story with a happy ending, right? He wins, he gets the talisman, he brings it home to his mother, he saves his mother's life. That is the type of thing you think he would remember, whereas Danny's story is just a story of trauma and surviving trauma. And he, tries to drink to get it away, but it's like he can't forget it. He can't move on from it.
Yeah, definitely there's a lot to contrast there for sure. I mean, I almost see them as being more different than they are similar. Because again, Jack is a kid. Jack is like almost like the heroic prince who went on a quest, and his adventure really was like an adventure. Mm-hmm. And Danny was just subjected to a nightmare.
Yeah,
that he barely survived, and he lost his father traumatically, who was trying to kill him at the time. So it's just tonally, thematically, just very different stuff, actually.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it is interesting. They both deal with like the idea of losing family. Like I'm thinking specifically about the Danny Torrance line of like the idea of your parents dying is a thing that like a 4-year-old can't even fully contemplate, and it's a thing that Jack was directly having to deal with and trying to prevent. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really.
They're different ages too.
They're very different ages. Yeah, I mean, there are. I mean, I think generally the thing that I find most fascinating is the idea that King returns to these characters years later, both years later for the characters and years later for him as a writer, and chooses to kind of start their stories depressingly. Like they're like both of these characters, despite the fact that they experienced things very, very differently as children, they don't start in exactly the same place because Danny's an alcoholic and Jack is not necessarily has substance abuse, although he's running still. They both are running. They both are running from their problems and hiding out, whether at the bottom of a bottle or at a small town in the middle of nowhere. And so it is interesting looking at these two things and saying, well, when King returns to a story that he wrote years ago, he never puts the main character in a spot that is like satisfying from the perspective of someone who like really liked this character. Like,
yeah,
like, if you left The Shining going like, oh man, I think Danny's gonna be okay, you open up Dr. Sleep and you're like, fuck. And I think the same thing kind of with the Talisman, where you're like, oh, he had this awesome adventure and now he's gonna have this great life. No, not really, actually. It's the Last Jedi effect, man. It's actually really fascinating because like this is the exact same thing that Rian Johnson did with Luke Skywalker that pissed people off so much. Is you take a character that is kind of beloved and then you do the thing that the people would least expect with them when you return to them decades later.
Yeah, I guess he just really likes that, and I have to admit that I like that too. Like I like the feeling of, it feels realistic.
Yeah.
It feels a lot more like everybody grows up and feels a little disappointed that they're not the king that they imagined they were going to grow up into, right? Like
Hmm.
in Jack Sawyer's case, it's like almost a direct. You almost literally mean that, um, and yeah. It also, I mean, just from standing back from like a cold blooded storytelling point of view, you got to give your character somewhere to go.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
have to give them an arc, and thus you have to give them a flaw to start with, and thus they got to be disappointing in some way.
Yeah.
Like,
Yep.
so that's it.
I agree. I agree. Toast Cat also asks, has Scott read The Witcher yet or watched Deep Space Nine? I have not read The Witcher. Um, I've watched like I've not watched Deep Space Nine like episode by episode from beginning to end, but like I caught a lot of episodes over the course of it playing on UPN over and over again.
Yeah.
You kids remember that? You remember UPN?
Well, I sure do. I mean, I think I've watched most of these Space Nine. But wait, what's the point of the question though? Are we?
I think maybe months and months ago I said I was rewatching
Okay.
Star Trek all the way through, and I'm still on Next Generation. I kind of fell off on doing that. There's too much TV out there, man.
Yeah, there is. I do love me some Deep Space Nine though.
Mm-hmm.
All right, next question from Sigma. How do you feel Jack's arc compares to Ed Deepnow's from Insomnia? What do you think that says about how King has changed?
That's a really interesting question, Matt. Just to remind you, do you remember who Ed Deepnow is in Insomnia?
Well, he's like the main antagonist who's kind of either been driven crazy or is crazy, and kind of becomes obsessed with becoming a terrorist.
Yeah.
And
similar kind of quasi possession by a greater evil thing going on with the two of them.
Yeah, it's interesting. And again, I mean, yes, quasi possession, but also where there's clearly plenty of room left over for you to blame them for their choices. I think even explicitly in Deepnow's case, toward the end, there's like moments where it's like you could choose not to go through with this, but like you're too far gone. You've let it sink in too deep at this point.
This is actually a really great framing of this whole thing, because I like how Sigma said, what do you think that says about how King has changed? Because I do think, obviously there is a lot of sympathy and empathy coming from the book towards Jack Torrance. And rightfully so. He led a pretty shitty life, like dealt a lot of bad cards, stuck his hand in a lot of wasp nest, if you will. I feel like by the 1990s and Insomnia, I feel like King has a lot less sympathy for Ed Deepnow, and I know it's different situations, but I feel like I mean, it's just the idea of making the guy who's being like manipulated and taken over by the evil is the antagonist in this one, where he was kind of set up to be the protagonist in The Shining, is in and of itself a shift in how we're going to portray all this stuff. Like Ed was bad from the beginning. There's never like a good version of Ed we see in that story.
Well, it's portrayed as being like some kind of creepy, complete two-facedness where Ralph likes Ed, and he's like, yeah, Ed, he's a nice guy to hang out with, and then Ed just like beats the shit out of his wife spontaneously.
Yeah, and
you're like, oh, actually, Ed is bad, and there's no temptation to be like, well, yeah, I mean, yeah, well, no, it's just like, no, he's actually just a monster who can put on a polite face sometimes.
Yeah,
and that's kind of as complicated as it was, and that is a lot less nuanced and ambiguous than Jack Torrance, and maybe does signal a sort of change. It's
I think so. Yeah.
Sigma had more questions though. That Sigma also says, how do you feel King's prose has evolved? I remember when I was 13, I bought this and Salem's Lot, and I was unimpressed by the style as compared to It or The Gunslinger. I even thought to myself, I'm not going to dig these books like everyone else does, am I?
That's interesting, because The Gunslinger is technically written before this. But can I be honest here, Matt?
Yeah.
When it comes to we talk about prose a lot, and I understand like why stuff works in the micro with prose.
Uh-huh.
I can look at a sentence and say this is a good sentence structure, and this is why. I'm super bad at like being able to tell you like generally about like style of prose over time, and this is I think going to be a challenge of this season in particular, because I honestly can't answer this question right now. Like, how has his prose evolved? I mean, I think he's better in a lot of ways. Like, I think he's better, but like if you ask me to give you a specific example of that, I don't know if I'd be able to do it.
No, I'll go one further and I'll say that people who claim to be able to like judge the quality of prose are just liars who are full of themselves. Because like, I mean, okay, so like the ending, like the ending page of Blood Meridian, I'm just like obsessed with it. Like I just love it, and I could not tell you why. Like that's the thing is I can't be like, oh, it's just because of the sentence, and it's like it's just such a good sentence. It's like, no, I don't know. It just strikes my brain in a way where I just love the sound of it and the image it conjures and the horror of it. It's this great image. It's these great words. It sounds good to my brain. And so what's funny to me, riffing on this comment, is that I think The Shining is prose wise very good, and I think the Salem's Lot is a little uneven. Can I back that up? No, not really. My recollection is that he kind of reached for some more what's the word, like elevated. Remember all the parts of the Salem's Lot where we're sort of like rhapsodizing about the town, and like some of that worked really well, and some of it felt a little it just kind of fell flat for me.
Well, the interesting thing about Salem's Lot to me is he's, like you said earlier, he's trying to do Bram Stoker. Like he's specifically trying to make Dracula, but American small town Dracula. And in a lot of ways, I think his prose kind of follows that, where there are moments where it is the typical Stephen King sitting at a bar telling you a story part, and there's moments where he spreads out and goes Peter Straubian at times. And you're right, there are moments of those that I absolutely loved, where they worked like the information passing through the telephone line and how we kind of zoom through the telephone line to hop around the town. I think that part really, really works, but there are moments where it works less. And the thing that I find so interesting, and this is what's so fascinating, is like Stigma here says, didn't really care for Salem's Lot, wasn't really impressed with The Shining prose wise, really, really loved The Gunslinger. And The Gunslinger is like a thing where like you don't even, I mean, I love that book. I love that book so much. I barely hear Stephen King's voice in it. It's so different from the way he writes everything else. Like I remember very distinctly when you got to Drawing of the Three, you were like, oh, this is totally different and I'm in love with it. And it's like, oh, well, that's the Stephen King voice you're finally hearing. It wasn't in The Gunslinger at all, because he wasn't writing like Stephen King at that point. So it just goes to show you like the way, you're absolutely right, how things ping off your brain in different ways.
Yeah, it's interesting. I would love to figure out like what influence he was writing The Gunslinger from, like in terms of like what was he? Because I agree with you, he was sort of trying to copy Stoker for Salem's Lot. What is he trying to copy for The Gunslinger, or copy?
He's trying to be epic and Western, and like he wants it. He knows the whole story is based off a poem, so I think he's trying to be a bit more poetic. It's I mean, he started it when he was 19 years old, right? So it's a kid who doesn't even know who he is and what his voice is going to be yet, trying to invent something. And I think there are moments in The Gunslinger, and that's why I love it so much, that you see Stephen King kind of come through. But it's just very, and it's why people bounce off that book so much, is because it's just so different.
And then you jump from there into Drawing of the Three, which is just kind of hilarious. Sigma had one more point where they said, Matt, have you ever watched Revolutionary Girl, Utina, or Vinland Saga? No, I've never watched those. I've only watched the Normie animes, like Naruto and Death Note, and I guess they've actually made us watch slightly more esoteric ones for Doofcasts back in the past, in the long past.
Remember Code Geass Lelouch
I
of
do.
the Rebellion?
The douche of the rebellion. I do remember that one.
Oh,
That was.
I don't hate very many things, folks. I hated that so much.
Yeah, I also disliked that. But we did like it. We watched Ping Pong. We watched
Mob Psycho.
Psychopaths, Mob Psycho, Psychopath, two different things.
I did not like Psychopaths. You liked that.
I like Psychopaths. Yeah, I think we both liked Mob Psycho somewhat.
Mhm.
I don't remember what else we watched that was officially anime. But then the Sigma goes on to say that they think we'd like those. Maybe so. And then they say, is anime melodramatic? I grew up with it, so I'm pretty accustomed to it and don't consider the melodramatic description. Don't understand the melodramatic description. I mean, yeah, like I think it definitely tends to be. But okay, so first of all like serialized storytelling trends toward the melodramatic.
Mhm.
I think that's a pretty pretty correct statement, actually. And like what, like I can just point you to Death Note and just like look at any time Light is doing anything and he's like raving, like just look at the chip eating scene and like the expressions on people's faces and like the voice acting, like just let's think about the voice acting and then think about like, okay, like nobody ever sounds like that in real life, and it's fine. These aren't criticisms, really. This is just like, yeah, it's more entertaining. They do it because it's more entertaining that way.
This is actually my comment. As the resident anime hater of the podcast, I think yes, anime is definitely melodramatic, but I think we need to stop using that word as an assumed critique or criticism.
Right.
Like there's nothing wrong inherently with melodrama. Like there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. It does bug me when people use that as if like, oh, it's a bit melodramatic, and that they're saying that enough is enough to declare it as bad. It's like no. Like the reason I don't like anime is not because of the melodrama. Certainly not.
Yeah, I mean, there are some things that I like because they're very grounded and realistic, and then there's Lord of the Rings. Which it feels weird to call it melodramatic, but like it is.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah,
it's fine.
Yeah, Matt, you can watch those animes and tell me if I like them.
Yeah, I'll put it on my to-do pile.
Okay. Gerardo says, Matt, you mentioned having been exposed to various cultural references to The Shining. So what surprised you the most about the source material in this read through?
Yeah. Well, the fact that Jack is this complicated figure, which didn't really match any of my expectations of how Jack was going to be. Like I had known, all of the adaptations and spoofs basically just cast him as a crazy guy, except maybe the miniseries.
Mm-hmm.
And I had known that King wanted him to be more sympathetic, and that was somewhat reflected in the miniseries. But just like the level of depth and nuance and complexity, I think caught me off guard, and how much I was kind of pulled into his struggles, and how much you can kind of identify. As much as he's like doing these terrible things and thinking these terrible things, you can still find a lot to identify with and relate to, which is kind of the secret of Stephen King, actually, is like understanding how to make you see yourself even in these characters who are doing terrible things, and kind of understand the universal human nature of it all. So yeah, basically Jack's character is the central element, and then the secondary surprising element, I guess, is just like the dreamlike, nightmarish quality of the prose at times, which is why I say that this book is better written. Is it pulls you into this like vibe of like sort of disorientation and dreamlike disorientation, where you're not sure what's real, you're not sure what's really happening. And I think a lot of that is subtle choices he's making with the prose itself. And I like that a lot.
Yeah, no, I think that's really cool. All right, let's move on to the next one.
Pear Jane says, so sad to see the end of this book. Still my favorite. My question is regarding Night Shift. Matt, what do you expect to learn from reading his short stories? And Scott, what are you most excited to rediscover?
You go ahead first, Matt.
Well, I mean, I love short stories as a medium, first of all. Like, I want to read more short stories than I do. And I think that short stories, I said a bit ago, my favorite thing of King's is actually shorter. It's more of a novella length. And so I really just want the opportunity to read several of his short works and see how he approaches it. I guess I love the way he does character, and I love the way he does the sort of Gardner storytelling style. And I think by reading a bunch of short stories, that will be one way to kind of quickly get a bunch of data points in the constellation of who is Stephen King.
Cool. Yeah. From my perspective, obviously I've read Night Shift a couple times, and it's his first short story collection, and there are a lot of really, really fun stories in here. I'm looking at the list now as I'm talking, and there's not one that like specifically jumps out to me that I'm like, oh my God, I can't wait for us to talk about this. The thing I guess I'm most generally excited about is to just dive into short stories with this kind of analysis. We've only ever done, from the short story perspective, Jerusalem's Lot and One for the Road when we covered Salem's Lot last year. And ironically, those are both in this collection, so we'll be skipping them when we go through them here. But I'm really fascinated by his short stories and the way he can be very gnarly and unfair at times to his characters in them, because the rules of a short story are different than the rules of a novel. And I don't know, I'm just really excited looking at these to just like, some of these are just really, really fun. Some of these are like really like, fuck, like The Last Rung on the Ladder is one that's jumping out to me that I think you're going to really enjoy, Matt. There's Children of the Corn on here also, which I know you've seen the movie, but as we discussed in that other Levels of the Tower episode, the book is rather different than the movie. There's a lot of fun here. This is kind of why I picked this collection, is because I think it's really, really great example of early young Stephen King writing at its best, and just some really fun, gnarly stories.
Yeah, no, that particularly sounds cool, because it sounds like it's in a bit of a different direction than we've been going with a lot of these novels.
Mm-hmm. You get to finally read Lawnmower Man and see how close it is to the movie.
Yeah, that really faithful adaptation. Yeah.
No, it's gonna be a lot of fun. I am a little curious how it's gonna go from a podcast perspective. Like, I'm not worried about you reading these stories and loving them. I'm worried about how exactly it's going to work talking about like 3 or 4 short stories in a single episode.
Fair enough.
Like, from page wise, content wise, it's going to be about as long as what we normally cover. But are we going to? I'm worried that these episodes are going to be really long, I guess.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I don't like to change the schedule, but we may need to stretch things out more. Who knows?
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see.
All right, next we have Shortstop 88, who says, due to the short bonus episode between Scott and his wife, I'd like to ask Matt, what are your expectations due to title and cultural / Scott osmosis for the rest of the season 3 books?
Shoot. Well, let's see. Night Shift I know very little about, except for the particular short stories where I have like seen an adaptation, in which case I have some good idea. The Long Walk, I think I know the plot outline of this story, although I don't know how it resolves, and I don't really know about the characters. I just know that's the thing, is I know the 1 or 2 sentence sales pitch for it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is what King is good at. I probably know a lot about it because while I have not actually seen the adaptations, I feel like I have absorbed every molecule of information about this story.
Sure.
But it's going to be one of those things where I say that, and then I'm totally going to be surprised by all kinds of things, just like with The Shining.
Sure.
Desperation. I know nothing about Desperation. And nothing about Desperation. So,
what about a little bit about 11/22/63? I guess the probably the one-liner.
Yeah, I know the premise of that. Probably maybe even, yeah, I know very little about that beyond the one-liner. Doom McKee, I know nothing about at all. Mr. Mercedes, I think it's like a detective, or like, is it a lawyer? See what I mean? I don't know. And Fairy Tale, I have like intentionally not learned anything about. So I know nothing about that.
So one of the things about Fairy Tale, should we put it up to a vote? I don't know if I feel comfortable giving the power to the people in this way, but we did have a lot of pushback when we talked about, am I going to read it? Because I haven't read that one yet either. Should we have Matt read it, and then he's the one that leads the discussions? Should we put that up to a vote, Matt? How are you feeling about that as of now? We have a few years to decide, but
yeah, Jesus. I mean, it's a fun idea. It would be fun to take back control after all these years.
Yeah.
So I mean, I'm down to do that. If people want it, if people think that's a fun idea.
Yeah, maybe we'll like set up a straw poll or something. And just see what people want to do.
Okay, sounds good.
No, that's a lot of fun. I think it's really interesting. Part of the reason I chose some of the books I chose is for this exact reason. And I guess that the question I want to ask you, and maybe the audience in general, is how, because The Shining was, I think, out of everything that we've ever covered on the main show here, the thing you knew the most about going into it. Like, you had seen both adaptations. It also has probably, out of all these things, the most cultural influence. So how do you think that affected both your reading experience and, talking about it? Because we did, I saw a couple posts on Reddit go through of people listening to the book while reading, and we're like, these guys seem to know what happens in the movie. Is this spoiler free? And like, my answer to those is always like, yeah, pretty much, but like kind of not, because our the way we talk about the book is still informed by the fact that we knew what was going to happen at the end, and that's not a thing that will ever be repeated on the rest of the show, because for the rest of these you're just not going to know, really. But how do you think it worked in our Shining coverage?
Yeah, it was just, the situation was I was totally spoiled on what was going to happen. So
Sure.
plot wise, I was spoiled. But like, the thing is, plot is like the least interesting part of the story. And
Sure.
and what I mean by that is it doesn't really matter if you know what's going to happen. Like, especially with Stephen King, because he loves to tell you what's going to happen later in the story. He absolutely loves to, in chapter 3, be like, little did Jack Torrance know that the boiler was going to explode and destroy the hotel at the end. And then that doesn't really diminish your enjoyment. If anything, it increases it, because you're like, well, wait, how do we get from here to there? So see, this is all down to personal taste. Like, some people really care about spoilers a lot, and I just, with a very small number of exceptions, I just don't. And
sure.
and so in terms of how it affected things, it's like, well, we mostly just talked about like character stuff, which I don't think it affected at all. So
sure. I do think, like, it is invariably true, though, that our character interpretations were informed by the fact that we knew where the story was going. Like
true.
there is part of me that wonders what your read on Jack would have been if you were approaching this completely fresh.
Sure, that and so do I, but I can't even guess, right? That's an interesting question, though.
So we did lose that by choosing to cover something that you knew where everything goes on it. But I agree. I mean, I think overall I'm happy with the quality of our conversations, and I enjoyed discussing this book with you. So I don't think it like hurt that, but like it was just definitely different from the other books that we've covered.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, so
Shortstop also asks, due to Scott mentioning how this deep analysis the last 2 months further improved his love of The Shining, what stories from Night Shift are you most looking forward to? We kind of answered this with Pear Jane a little bit already, but I'll just go down the list and say some of my favorite. I really liked Graveyard Shift. That's a really fun one. I really liked Sometimes They Come Back. I really liked The Ledge. Quitters Inc. was really fucked up. I really, really like The Last Rung on the Ladder. I mean, I like all of them, but those are the ones that in my memory spring to mind.
Cool.
And then the last question from Shortstop is, how are y'all doing? Has your 2023 been good so far? Matt, How you doing?
It's been a really busy year for me. I think there was a lot of there was a lot more kind of space back in the COVID years, as we can loosely gesture in that direction, because there was a lot of slowdown kind of a lot of stuff across the board. Just
Sure.
and now a lot of stuff has picked back up. So I've just been real busy and kind of shocked and dismayed that it is almost a quarter of the way through the year already, because I feel like I just woke up. I mean,
Yeah. It's almost April already. How the fuck did that happen?
Exactly.
Yeah. I'm doing my life is good for me right now. Everything's going well. My family's all healthy. We're all doing good. My son turns 2 tomorrow, actually, in 43 minutes from the time we're recording this. My son turns 2. He wasn't alive when we started this project, which tells you how long we've been doing this for. No, things are going really good for me.
Great. Yeah. No, I should modify and say things are going well for me. It's just currently so busy that it's kind of hard to look around and smell the roses.
I agree with that. I mean, work is crazy busy for me right now. This is crazy busy for me. Life is busy. I got a lot going on. Yeah.
All right. Next question. From eman 9001. Question for Matt. For me, if you they say, if this really is the last season of Kingslingers, are there any books that you wished you could have covered that didn't make the list? Is Matt blind picking the books he hasn't read a perfect premise for season 4? I mean, I think the idea of this season being the greatest hits is like, well, this is probably all the books that I've heard of Kings.
And some that you haven't.
And some that I haven't. So like, I'm not sure what I would, I'm not saying I won't read more Stephen King after this project is done, but I'm not like burning to read any particular book, because if I were, we probably would have just put it on this list.
Yeah. Honestly, that's kind of the way I feel. And I want to reiterate, because people do see the final season thing and freak out a little bit, that like, we're definitely not going anywhere. We might just stop talking about Stephen King in the way that we have been the last few years. And it's a problem you're not going to have to worry about until early 2025, I think.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, when you look at the man's bibliography, obviously there's plenty of books on here of his that I love. But like, I feel like there is at some point like diminishing returns from continuing to cover these books once we've obviously The Dead Zone is a pretty big book. Cujo, but again, that's one that you've seen the movie on. Pet Sematary is a book I'm terrified of reading again. There's definitely like King classics on here that we have not covered, certainly. But I don't know. I just feel like, with this, like, it's not that we couldn't mine content out of it. I just wonder if at some point we just gotta be like, yeah, we've hit all the big ones. We did the Dark Tower. We did the things connected to the Dark Tower. We did some of the greatest, most well-known, best books in my estimation. What else is there to do? Like, I don't realistically see a situation in which we truly read and discuss every single Stephen King book.
Yeah, that sounds about right to me. And you would get sick of that. You would be like, okay, they've jumped the shark.
We already repeat ourselves like 6,000 times an episode. Imagine how much we'd be doing that on book 74 in 2037.
Especially if we're getting down to books that like we don't like anymore, which would happen at a certain point, I think.
Like, again, there was a hot minute where I was considering putting like a most infamous book on the list for the season, and I was looking at the Tommyknockers, and because I was curious, like, what would it be like to do a book that I don't love myself and I think has a lot of problems, but I think is also perhaps better than a lot of people give it credit for? What would that be like? And I ended up balking at the idea, because I was like, that's a 600-page book. I don't know if I want to sit in a book that I'm not enjoying for 14 episodes, and that Matt possibly is not enjoying either, I think that would really lower the content and the quality of the show. It's not that there's not things that we could talk about, but I think part of what motivates the energy and the excitement of the show is that we're genuinely enjoying the things we're talking about. Like, I'm not saying we couldn't find fascinating and interesting things to talk about in the Tommyknockers, but I just feel like it would lack the propulsive energy that I think we have when we're just really, really vibing with a book.
Yeah, I mean, we know this. We go over on the Doofcast feed, and you know, every once in a while there'll be a movie that we watch that we just didn't like, and so we're just complaining about it and criticizing it the whole time. And I mean, that can be fun, and it's in a certain way, but it's actually not nearly as fun as it is to just talk about a thing that we both loved.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And I'm very fortunate that so far, nothing that I've picked for you to read, you just flat out were like, Scott, what the fuck? No.
Yeah. It's hard for me to imagine that from King, but I haven't read Tommyknockers, so.
All right. Next, we have Gilead 1973, who says, my question is for Matt. Ooh, you're getting a lot this week, Matt.
Yes, yeah.
Matt has mentioned his own writing throughout the seasons. Is that content available anywhere to read, online or in print?
Short answer, no. Really, when I reference writing, it's just that it's always been a hobby of mine to write short stories, and a few novel length things that I just wrote, and I'm like, this is not very good. And I don't think I'm being like unduly self-deprecating. I think I'm just accurately being like, this is not really worth trying to get published. There are a couple of short stories that I've been trying to get published lately, but haven't found a home for them. Trying to think if I probably have a few like short story things. If I'll reference the so-called writers here, actually, because that is sort of a repository of my fiction, which is years ago, me and Scott's friend Michael did a podcast called So-Called Writers, and the gimmick of So-Called Writers was every week we would come up with 3 random words, and the challenge for the next week would be to write a story in half an hour using those 3 random words somewhere in the story. And it was basically meant to be an exercise to just get you in the habit of writing and to kind of remove the like fear of writing, of like, kind of like the perfectionism of like, I have to have just like the best idea, because it's like, no, you got to have these 3 words in it. You got to have it done in 30 minutes past the time when you sit down. And those are the rules. And so it almost can't be amazing. It's just something. And we did that for a while.
I think like half a year.
Yeah, we probably like half a year. And we had done versions of it for actually a couple of years before that, just like not podcasting it, just doing like between ourselves. And so I think most, if not all, of those so-called writer stories are somewhere online, although maybe not consolidated. And I wouldn't say those are like the best ever because of the restrictions on how they were written that I just described. But that was really fun, and that spawned another podcast on the Doof Network called "Do the Right Thing," WRITE, which that was Alexandra and Jarvis basically picking up y'all's idea and going much further with it, because they did that for years. Yeah, they kept it up admirably, an admirably long time. Yeah, because it's hard to do. Actually, it's actually pretty hard to make yourself not only write something every week, but have it be good enough that you're willing to read it out loud on a microphone, which is what we would we would do. I mean, I know this because the two of them asked me to guest star on that thing multiple times, and I never did because I'm terrified of writing. Yeah, it's but that was really fun, and I love to write, and I love to think about writing, and that's why it's like that's always in the back of my mind when we're having these conversations. Yeah. But I mean, it might be good for me to collect all this stuff and put it on a page or something, but currently that doesn't exist. Anyway, next question from Brett 7921. Listening back to the Drawing of the Three overview episode, Kyrgyzstan asked, how are the download, comment, Patreon, etc. numbers looking for the Kingslingers podcast? You said at the time that it wasn't your most popular show. well, now that you're in your third season, how has that changed? Is it your most popular show? I imagine with the amount of answers you get now for discussion questions that it would be.
Yep.
Yeah.
But by far, for sure. It's definitely the most popular thing you and I have ever done.
Yeah, it's funny. Back in those days, I think like our best day ever back then is like a really bad day for us nowadays.
Yeah.
In terms of overall numbers and everything.
No, we're doing really well. The Kingslingers hit 1 million downloads total before the beginning of the year, which is just like, of course, incredibly humbling and cool to see. Something I never thought would be possible. It's doing really well, and it's very comforting, because I guess like you could kind of say that doing this podcast was sort of like Stephen King deciding to publish things as Richard Bachman, in that we did our We've Got Worm podcast, and we kind of caught fire in that fan community, and like suddenly that like overnight became something that people were actually listening to, which before that show we were just doing things to like 40 maybe people, and we just had been doing that for like a year and a half, and then suddenly like people were actually listening and emailing us, and we were like, oh my god, this is insane. And then like when we got to the end of that stuff, we were kind of like, can we do it again? And can we do it again in an environment where nobody knows us, and we can't rely on any kind of goodwill from people knowing us and knowing what we do? And so we went into another community that's much bigger than the Worm, the Parahumans community, just by the nature of King being one of the most popular authors of all time. And it was kind of a bet with ourselves to see if we could do it again. And we did. And it's really, really refreshing to see. It's been great. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, it's been great. I mean, just broadly speaking, numbers wise, it seems like just more people are finding the show all the time, and so the numbers just kind of go up slowly but surely, which is nice. And honestly, I don't think about the numbers often.
No.
After doing this for so many years, it's just like background now to me, but anyway, yes, it is gratifying when I do remember to look at them, because I do have to look at them sometimes to do like bookkeeping stuff. So
it is so much. It's so funny how much that's changed, because when Worm stuff was coming out, when We've Got Worm would come out, like I would live on the stat sheet on Wednesdays when those episodes would drop, because I was just fascinated to see those numbers go up, and it was like hugely important to me. And I maybe check Kingslingers numbers once a week just to be like, I'll just log on and see how this week's episode did, and oh yeah, that did pretty good. And yeah, I mean, we look at the trend line and be like, oh yeah, those are going up overall, which is good. We feel satisfied that more people are finding the show, and we're retaining some people. It is interesting kind of watching the intra book numbers fluctuate. Like I think the first episode of a new novel always does super well. And like, cause I'm assuming because new people find it, and then, we always lose some of those people that just don't like the type of show we do, which is fine. I'm not criticizing those people. It's just some people don't like these kind of conversations, and that's totally fine. And you'll see the numbers kind of fluctuate over the course of it. And like I said at the beginning, the overview episodes usually perform the least well. But it's fine. We're doing good. We're enjoying it. We're not even close to like, we could do this full time and quit our jobs mode. And I don't know if we'll ever be, to be honest with you, but it is very cool that we continue to get to do this, and that the support of our patrons allows it to basically be totally funded by them. They're keeping all the equipment that we need to get, and all the space that we need to rent for hosting and all that stuff. They're allowing us to do that. So
yeah,
it's great to be able to put all the money we get from them back into the content itself.
Yeah. We never have to think about, can we afford this thing that it would be nice for us to have to do a slightly better job at this.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I'm very, very happy with where we are, I guess is the short answer after the long answer.
Yeah. Thanks for asking, Brett.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. All right. That is our last question. I think that's going to do it for us this week, Matt. We said at the beginning we didn't feel like we had too much to talk about, and then we went for 2 hours, which is what we always do. Remember when I said this was going to happen? Do you remember?
You
do you
did,
remember
yeah.
before we started recording? I said exactly this.
Right. And I tried to say, like, I just don't have that much to say. And then, that's what always happens.
That is it. Next week on the show, we are rewatching Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, and we're going to see if our reading of this novel changes how we feel about that movie at all. I think that's going to be a fun little experiment. We're also, I think, just for fun, going to watch the Simpsons episode, The Shinning, just for fun. Because why not?
I love the Simpsons so much. All right. Yeah. Remember, you can reach out to us via email at kingslingerspod@gmail.com or on Twitter @kingslingerspod. And of course, it's always cool to go head on over to the subreddit at r/doofmedia. Of course, there's no discussion question this week, but you can just see what people are talking about over there anyway.
Yeah, start talking with people about Night Shift. Get ready for that. Speaking of Night Shift, we mentioned this briefly last week, Matt, but the reality of the situation is much more complicated than we thought. If you are like Matt and tend to audiobook over read words, Night Shift is going to be a real struggle for y'all. There are 3 different audiobooks on Audible for Night Shift, and even amongst the 3 of them, 4 stories are not available. So I have no idea why this is. I have no idea why one of the most popular authors on earth doesn't have just one audiobook that has all the short stories in freaking bound book that's been out for 50 years. No idea. The truth of the matter is that Matt is going to have to probably actually, for the first time on the series, read words, actually.
God, I can't handle it, man. No,
so if you were hoping to read along and to just audiobook along, I am so sorry. It's going to be a little bit more complicated than that. There's going to be a few stories you're not going to be able to do that on.
Yeah. Well, I've already ordered the book, so I guess we'll just make it happen.
I actually think this is going to be really fun because I'm going to get to talk to you about like how is reading King different than listening to King in your mind.
Yeah, there you go. There's that silver lining.
But make sure you subscribe if you haven't already, because Night Shift is coming and you don't want to miss that, and you're going to have to go buy the book because you can't listen to it. But you can find us basically anywhere podcasts can be found. Yeah.
If you like Kingslingers and you want to support us, then please consider donating to our Patreon at patreon.com/doofmedia.
And if you cannot afford to donate right now, that is absolutely okay. You can always help us out by sharing this podcast, by letting some people know about the problems with Night Shift. You can just continue to help us out. And then, of course, you can leave us a rating and a review. No new review to read this week for you guys, but hopefully we'll get some soon because we love reading those. They make us feel good about ourselves.
Yeah.
We crave them.
Yeah. We're like, laughter vampires or whatever, except it's enjoying podcast vampires.
Sure, Matt. We're exactly like laughter vampires. That's like that's exactly what I would have said. Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Whew, wow. All right, folks. We will see you right back here next week with Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. Long days and pleasant nights.
And may you have twice the number.
Okay. Let's do it. Ready?
Yes, I am. Yes.
Let's go in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Matt?
What?
You're supposed to say 1.
I did. I said it so perfectly that you didn't hear me.
Okay. I'll play back the tape later and see if that's true or not, but I honestly didn't hear it at all.
I swear to God that I said it. Maybe it didn't make it over the line or something.
Okay. I'm just going to start talking for the show.
Okay.